The morning air felt crisp against Isabella's face as she sat on her usual bench in Central Park. This spot had become her office, her living room, and sometimes, when the weather was good, her bedroom too. She pulled her thin jacket tighter and opened the worn notebook on her lap. The pages were filled with detailed building designs and architectural sketches, beautiful dreams from a life she no longer had. 3 years. That's how long Isabella had been homeless. 3 years since she had lost everything because of someone else's crime. She had once been a rising star at one of New York's top architecture firms. She had a beautiful apartment, respect in her field, and a future so bright she sometimes joked she needed sunglasses just to look at it. Then it all vanished overnight when her business partner stole millions from their clients and disappeared, leaving her to take the blame. With no money for good lawyers and her reputation in tatters, Isabella watched her life crumble piece by piece. First her job, then her savings, then her apartment. Now, at 32, her possessions fit in a backpack, and her only luxury was this notebook filled with the buildings she still designed in her head. The sound of joggers passing barely registered as she carefully shaded the glass dome of her latest creation. This one was special. A community center with natural light filling every corner. The kind of building that made people feel safe just by walking inside. Her pencil moved with sure strokes despite her cold fingers. Alexander Raid was on his 5th mile when something made him slow down. He wasn't sure what caught his eye, maybe the unusual stillness of the woman on the bench amid the rushing New Yorkers, or maybe the intense focus on her face. Either way, he found himself stopping, breathing hard from his run, and glancing over her shoulder. What he saw made him forget his burning lungs. The drawing was extraordinary, professional quality with innovative elements he rarely saw even in the high-end buildings his company developed. Flowing lines created spaces that seemed both grand and welcoming at once. "Excuse me," he said before he could stop himself. "That design is remarkable." Isabella's head snapped up, her body tensing as it always did when strangers approached. Living on the streets had taught her caution. The man standing there was tall and fit, dressed in expensive running gear. His dark hair was damp with sweat, but something about his eyes, a deep, thoughtful brown, seemed strangely familiar. "Thank you," she said quietly, beginning to close her notebook. She learned that admiration could quickly turn to something else when people realized her situation. "Aren't you an architect?" Alexander asked, staying a respectful distance away. A sad smile touched her lips. "I was. Once." Something in her voice made Alexander look closer at her face. There was a dignity there, at odds with her worn clothes and the small backpack tucked beside the bench. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and though her face showed the strain of hard living, there was an elegance to her features that survival hadn't erased. "That concept, the way you've designed the entry flow to bring people together while still maintaining private spaces, it's brilliant," he said, pointing to her drawing. Surprise flickered across Isabella's face. Most people didn't understand the technical aspects of her work. "You know architecture. I develop commercial properties," Alexander said simply, not mentioning the billions his company controlled. "I've worked with many architects, but few with your eye for how people actually use spaces." For just a moment, Isabella allowed herself to engage as the professional she once was. The problem with most public buildings is they forget that humans need both connection and retreat. This design gives both. As they talked, Alexander felt an increasingly strange sensation, something about her voice, her gestures as she explained her design concepts. It all felt like an echo from somewhere in his past. He studied her features more carefully, trying to place her. Isabella noticed his stare and misinterpreted it. She'd grown used to people looking at her differently once they realized she was homeless. Her walls went back up. "I should go," she said, tucking her notebook into her backpack. "Wait," Alexander said. "I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable. It's just, do we know each other?" Isabella stood, slinging her backpack over one shoulder. The morning sunlight hit her face at a new angle, and suddenly Alexander felt the ground shift beneath him. Behind the exhaustion and the hardship, he recognized the woman he had once asked to be his wife. "Isabella?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the park sounds. She froze, properly looking at him for the first time. The recognition didn't come immediately. 7 years and vastly different circumstances had changed them both. But then she saw it, the small scar near his right eyebrow from a childhood accident he'd once told her about, the way his head tilted slightly when confused. "Alexander?" Her voice trembled with disbelief. In that moment, as joggers rushed past and the city roared around them, two people who had once promised to share a lifetime stood face to face again. Their eyes locked, 1,000 questions passing between them. How was she here on this bench? How had he found her after all these years? Neither could have guessed that this chance meeting would change everything, that their separate journeys of success and survival were about to become one story again. The next day, Isabella couldn't focus on her drawings. Her mind kept drifting back to yesterday's strange meeting with Alexander. After recognizing each other, they had both been too shocked to say much. He had stammered something about needing to talk more, and they had agreed to meet again at the same bench today. Part of her wanted to run away, to avoid facing the man who had once been her entire world, but a stronger part needed answers. She arrived early, clutching a paper cup of coffee someone had kindly bought her from a nearby cart. The warm cup felt good against her cold hands. Fall was turning colder, and winter worried her more than she wanted to admit. She had survived 3 winters on the streets, but each one took something from her that never quite returned in the spring. "You came." Alexander's voice made her look up. He wasn't in running clothes today, but wore jeans and a simple sweater that probably cost more than what she used to spend on rent. He held 2 paper bags and another coffee cup. "I brought breakfast," he said, his voice uncertain as he sat down, leaving space between them. "If that's okay." Isabella nodded, accepting the bag. Inside was a warm bagel with cream cheese. Her stomach growled loudly, and she felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Thank you," she said quietly, taking a bite. Food was never something she turned down these days. They ate in awkward silence for a few minutes, both stealing glances when they thought the other wasn't looking. Isabella noticed how success had changed him. He moved with more confidence now, his shoulders straighter, his gaze more direct. But his hands still fidgeted when nervous, just like before. "I can't believe it's really you," Alexander finally said. "After all this time, and to find you here, like this." He trailed off, clearly unsure how to talk about her situation. "You mean homeless?" Isabella said bluntly. "It's okay, you can say it. I've had 3 years to get used to the word." Alexander winced. "What happened, Isabella? Last I knew, you were finishing architecture school with job offers already coming in." Isabella took a deep breath. She had told this story so many times to social workers and shelter staff that it should have been easy, but somehow, telling Alexander made all the pain fresh again. "I did well after school," she began. "Got hired by Gregory and Partners. Worked my way up fast. By 28, I was made partner with Tom Gregory's son Bradley. We formed a new division focused on sustainable urban design." She paused, taking a sip of coffee. "Things were good for about a year. We were winning contracts, making a name for ourselves. Then clients started calling, saying their project funds were missing. At first, we thought it was a banking error." Alexander listened intently as she continued. It wasn't. Bradley had been stealing money for over a year. When it all came out, he disappeared, literally overnight. Left the country with millions. Her voice grew harder. "Since we were equal partners on paper, I was legally responsible too. They froze all my accounts during the investigation. I couldn't pay my rent, couldn't hire a decent lawyer." Alexander's face darkened. "Didn't you try to contact anyone for help? Friends? Family?" He hesitated. "Me." Isabella's laugh held no humor. "My parents had both passed by then. As for friends, you'd be surprised how quickly they vanish when you're associated with fraud. And you," she looked at him directly now. "I did try to reach you, Alexander, many times." Confusion crossed his face. "What? When?" "When everything first happened. I called the last number I had for you. I emailed. I even sent letters to your company address once I found out about your success." Her voice was steady now, the hurt long dulled by time. "You never responded." Alexander's face drained of color. "Isabella, I never got any messages from you. Not one. I would have helped you in a heartbeat if I'd known." She studied his face, trying to detect a lie, but saw only genuine shock. Well, it doesn't matter now. It's been 7 years since you left for Silicon Valley, and 3 since I lost everything. Ancient history on both counts. But something bothered Alexander. My assistant, he said suddenly. Diane has managed all my communications for years. She's very protective of my time. A cold feeling settled in his stomach. She might have filtered out messages she thought would distract me, especially during our critical growth years. Isabella shrugged, though the thought that her pleas for help might have been deliberately blocked made her feel sick. Like I said, ancient history. But it's not, Alexander insisted, leaning closer. Isabella, look at me. If I had known you were in trouble, I would have dropped everything to help you. You have to believe that. For a moment, Isabella allowed herself to remember the Alexander she had once loved, the brilliant, kind man who had promised to build a life with her before his sudden opportunity in tech had pulled him away. They had agreed to a clean break rather than try long distance. It had seemed sensible at the time. Why did you never try to contact me again? After you made it big? She asked, the question that had haunted her lonely nights. Alexander looked down at his hands. I thought you'd moved on. A mutual friend mentioned you were engaged about a year after I left. He looked up. To Bradley Gregory, actually. Isabella's eyes widened. What? I never dated Bradley, let alone got engaged to him. Who told you that? Lisa. From our study group. Lisa had a huge crush on you. She must have made it up. Isabella trailed off as pieces fell into place. All those wasted years of thinking he hadn't cared enough to even answer her calls for help. They sat in silence, processing the cruel tricks fate had played. Finally, Alexander spoke again, his voice gentle. Tell me about these past 3 years. How have you survived? Isabella told him about the shelters that were never safe enough, the small jobs that never paid enough, the public libraries where she went to stay warm and use computers to search for work. She explained how her reputation in architecture had been destroyed, how former colleagues crossed the street to avoid her. But you kept designing, Alexander said, nodding toward her notebook. A small smile touched her lips for the first time. It's the one thing no one could take from me. As the morning grew brighter around them, something shifted between them, not forgiveness yet, but perhaps understanding. When Alexander finally stood to leave, he hesitated. Isabella, I know you have every reason not to trust me, but please, let me help you now. At least with a place to stay, food. Pride flashed in her eyes. I don't want your charity, Alexander. Not charity, he said quickly. A chance to use your talent again. My company needs an architect with fresh ideas for a new project. It would be a real job with a real salary. Isabella looked at him suspiciously. You're just making this up. I'm not, he insisted. Look up New Horizons Community Development. It's a genuine project. Come to the office tomorrow and see for yourself. As he walked away, Isabella opened her notebook to a fresh page. Instead of a building, she sketched Alexander's face, the way he looked now, with success etched into his features, but also with the shadow of regret in his eyes. Tomorrow, she decided she would go see this project of his. Not because she trusted him again, but because for the first time in 3 years, someone had looked at her and seen not a homeless woman, but an architect. Isabella stood outside the gleaming glass tower, her reflection a stark contrast to the smartly dressed people rushing in and out. She had spent the morning in a public bathroom, washing as best she could and putting on her cleanest clothes, a simple blue shirt and her only pair of jeans without visible holes. She'd pulled her hair back neatly, but nothing could hide the fact that she didn't belong here. Taking a deep breath, she pushed through the revolving door. The security guard at the front desk looked her up and down, his expression clearly suspicious. Can I help you? He asked, his tone suggesting he doubted she had legitimate business in the building. I'm here to see Alexander Reid, she said, trying to sound confident. About the New Horizons project. The guard's eyebrows shot up. Do you have an appointment? Before she could answer, a voice called from across the lobby. Isabella, you made it. Alexander walked toward her, dressed in a tailored suit that made him look every inch the successful businessman he had become. Heads turned as he crossed the lobby. Clearly, everyone knew who he was. She's with me, Ted, Alexander told the guard, who immediately straightened up and nodded. Of course, Mr. Reid. Sorry for the confusion. Alexander led her to a private elevator, pressing his keycard against a sensor. My office is on the top floor, he explained as the doors closed. Isabella remained silent, suddenly overwhelmed. What was she doing here? Yesterday on the park bench was one thing, but this, standing in his world, made her painfully aware of how far they had drifted apart. The elevator opened directly into a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A large desk occupied one end, but most of the space was taken up by a conference table covered with building models and blueprint rolls. This is the New Horizons project, Alexander said, gesturing to the table. It's supposed to be affordable housing combined with community spaces, but honestly, the designs we've received so far, he made a face. Well, they're boring boxes, nothing innovative. Isabella approached the table cautiously, drawn despite herself to the architectural models. She could immediately see the problems. The buildings were functional but soulless, with no consideration for how people would actually live in the spaces. May I? She asked, picking up a pencil from the table. Alexander nodded encouragingly. Please. She pulled a blank sheet of paper toward her and began to sketch rapidly. Your current design separates the housing from the community spaces, which immediately creates a divide. Instead, what if you did this? Her pencil flew across the paper, drawing a new configuration where green spaces flowed between residential areas, with community buildings integrated throughout. Alexander watched in silence as she worked, her confidence growing with each stroke. For 20 minutes, she forgot about her circumstances, forgot about their complicated past. She was just an architect solving a problem. When she finally looked up, Alexander was staring at her with open admiration. That's exactly what this project has been missing, he said quietly. A human touch. Isabella put down the pencil, suddenly self-conscious again. It's just a rough idea. It's brilliant, he insisted. And I'd like to hire you as a consultant to develop it further. Her heart skipped a beat, but suspicion quickly followed. Is this real, Alexander? Or are you just creating a position out of pity? His expression grew serious. This is a legitimate job offer. The project needs your vision, and I'm prepared to pay market rate for your expertise. He slid a contract across the table. I had this drawn up this morning. Take time to read it. There's no rush. Isabella scanned the document, her eyes widening at the salary figure. It was generous, more than fair for a consulting position. This would mean I answer to the project manager, not to you directly? She asked, noticing the reporting structure. Alexander nodded. Complete professional separation. You'd be working with the team, not for me personally. I thought that might be easier. She appreciated the thought. Working directly under him would have been too complicated with their history. This arrangement gave her independence. There's something else, he said, opening a drawer in his desk. He pulled out a set of keys. The company keeps several apartments for visiting consultants. This one is available for the duration of your contract. Isabella's throat tightened. A real job. A real place to live. It seemed too good to be true. I don't know, Alexander, she said hesitantly. What happens when the job ends? I go back to the park bench. By then, you'll have references, recent work experience, and savings, he pointed out. But more importantly, you'll have a chance to rebuild your reputation. Isabella walked to the window, looking out at the city that had both built her up and torn her down. She could see Central Park in the distance, the tiny green bench where she had spent so many days just trying to survive. I need to know something first, she said, turning back to face him. Have you looked into what happened with Bradley Gregory? Is any of this contingent on whether I was actually guilty or not? Alexander's expression softened. Your guilt or innocence doesn't change that you're an exceptional architect. But yes, I've started looking into it. I have people who can dig much deeper than the police did. And if it turns out there's no way to clear my name, she pressed. Then we deal with that reality. But I believe you, Isabella. I always have. Those simple words, I believe you, hit her harder than she expected. For 3 years, no one had believed her side of the story. Not the police, not former friends, not colleagues. The weight of being finally believed by someone made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. She blinked them back quickly and picked up the contract again. I'd like to sleep on this, if that's okay. Of course, Alexander agreed. Take all the time you need. He hesitated, then added, "But please at least take the apartment key for tonight. There's a storm coming, and the thought of you out there." Isabella looked at the keys in his outstretched hand. Pride told her to refuse, to maintain her independence. But practicality whispered louder. A real bed, a hot shower, safety from the approaching storm. She took the keys, her fingers brushing his briefly. "Just for tonight," she said firmly. "Until I decide about the job." Alexander smiled, relief visible on his face. "The address is in this envelope, along with some cash for food and basics. The fridge should be stocked, but if you need anything else." "I'll manage," she cut him off, uncomfortable with his concern. "I've been taking care of myself for a long time." As she turned to leave, Alexander called after her. "Isabella?" She paused at the elevator. "Whatever you decide about the job, I'm glad I found you again." She didn't answer, just stepped into the elevator and watched the doors close between them. As the elevator descended, she clutched the keys tightly, feeling their unfamiliar weight in her palm. They represented more than just shelter. They were a doorway back to her old life, or at least something close to it. But could she trust this opportunity? Could she trust him? As the elevator reached the ground floor, Isabella realized she was genuinely torn for the first time in years. Life on the streets was hard, but at least she answered to no one. Taking Alexander's offer meant opening herself to disappointment again. She stepped out of the building into the afternoon sunlight, the envelope with the address clutched in her hand. Above her, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. The storm was coming, just as Alexander had said. With a deep breath, Isabella hailed a taxi, something she hadn't done in years, and gave the driver the address. As the city blurred past the windows, she allowed herself, just for a moment, to hope. The apartment was small but beautiful, with clean lines and large windows overlooking the city. Isabella stood in the doorway for a long moment, almost afraid to step inside. The place smelled of fresh paint and new furniture, nothing like the shelters and hidden corners she'd called home for the past 3 years. Finally, she walked in, setting her worn backpack carefully on the floor. The kitchen gleamed with stainless steel appliances. The living room had a comfortable-looking couch and a television that seemed impossibly thin. There were fresh flowers on the coffee table. Isabella went to the bathroom first. The sight of a clean shower with fluffy white towels made her throat tight. She turned the water on and stood under the hot spray for nearly an hour, washing away years of struggle. She shampooed her hair 3 times before it finally felt clean. Wrapped in a bathrobe she found hanging on the door, Isabella explored the rest of the apartment. The bedroom had a queen-sized bed with crisp white sheets. The closet was empty except for a few basic items in her size: 2 pairs of jeans, some t-shirts, a warm sweater, and a professional-looking blazer. There was even a pair of simple black flats on the floor. Alexander had thought of everything. The gesture was both thoughtful and uncomfortable, a reminder of how far she had fallen and how much she now needed help. After dressing in the new clothes, Isabella opened the refrigerator. It was stocked with simple, healthy foods, nothing fancy, but more options than she'd had in years. She made herself a sandwich and sat by the window, watching as the promised storm rolled in. Rain pelted against the glass as she considered her options. Taking the job meant accepting Alexander's help, which hurt her pride. But pride wouldn't keep her warm or fed, and the project was genuinely interesting, the kind of meaningful architecture she'd always wanted to create. By morning, she had made her decision. She would take the job, but on her terms. She would be professional and keep her personal history with Alexander separate from their work. She would save every penny and rebuild her life independently. 2 weeks later, Isabella sat in a conference room surrounded by the New Horizons project team. Her initial sketches had evolved into detailed plans that had impressed everyone. She wore borrowed clothes and lived in a borrowed apartment, but her ideas were entirely her own. "The community garden connects these 2 residential blocks," she explained, pointing to her design on the large screen. "It creates natural meeting spaces while giving residents a sense of ownership." Thomas, the project manager, nodded approvingly. The city planning department already loves the concept. They said it's refreshingly human-centered. Isabella felt a small glow of pride. This was what she had trained for, what she had once excelled at before losing everything. creating spaces where people could truly live, not just exist. As the meeting ended, Thomas pulled her aside. "Raid wants an update. Can you come up to his office?" Isabella hadn't seen Alexander much since taking the job. He had kept his distance, letting her work with the team without his interference. She appreciated that he was keeping his promise about professional separation. Alexander's assistant, Diane, looked up as Isabella entered the waiting area outside his office. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "He's expecting you," Diane said coolly, gesturing toward the door. Something about the woman's tone made Isabella pause. "Have we met before?" she asked. Diane smiled thinly. "No, I don't believe so." She returned to her computer, effectively dismissing Isabella. Alexander greeted her warmly as she entered his office. "The team can't stop talking about your designs," he said, genuinely pleased. "You've transformed the entire concept." "Thank you," Isabella said, keeping her tone professional despite the flutter in her stomach at his praise. The team has been very supportive. They discussed the project progress for several minutes. Isabella was just about to leave when Alexander asked, "How's the apartment working out?" "It's perfect," she admitted. "More than I need, actually." "I'm glad." He hesitated, then added, "I have some news about Bradley Gregory." Isabella's heart jumped. "You found him?" Alexander nodded, his expression serious. "My investigator located him in Buenos Aires. He's living under a different name, but it's definitely him." Isabella sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. "After all this time," she whispered. "There's more," Alexander continued. "We found evidence, bank transfers, emails, forged documents with your signature. He set you up very deliberately, Isabella." Her hands trembled. "Can we prove it?" "Legally, I mean." "I think so. I've hired the best fraud attorney in the city. He thinks we have a strong case to clear your name." Alexander pushed a folder across the desk. "All the evidence is here. The lawyer wants to meet tomorrow." Isabella opened the folder with shaking hands. There it was, proof of her innocence. Emails where Bradley discussed framing her. Bank statements showing money moved under her forged signature. It was everything she had needed 3 years ago. "Why?" she asked, looking up at Alexander with tears in her eyes. "Why would he do this to me?" "According to what we found, he was in serious gambling debt. He needed money fast, and—" Alexander paused, looking uncomfortable. "And what?" "And he was apparently in love with you. When you rejected his advances, he decided if he couldn't have you, he'd destroy you." Isabella remembered how Bradley had asked her out several times, how she had gently but firmly declined, keeping their relationship strictly professional. She had never imagined he would retaliate so destructively. "I can't believe one person could cause so much damage," she said softly. Alexander moved around the desk and knelt beside her chair. "Isabella, we're going to fix this. The lawyer thinks we can not only clear your name, but also get financial compensation." Overwhelmed, she did something she hadn't planned. She threw her arms around him in a tight hug. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. For a moment, they stayed like that, the years between them seeming to dissolve. Then Isabella pulled back, embarrassed by her emotional display. "I should go," she said, standing quickly. "I need to review these documents before meeting the lawyer." As she gathered the folder, Isabella noticed a framed photo on Alexander's desk she hadn't seen before. It showed a much younger version of them both, arms around each other at a university party. She hadn't known he had kept any reminder of their past. "You were always the most talented architect in our class," Alexander said, following her gaze to the photo. "I knew it then, and seeing your work now only confirms it. The world needs your vision, Isabella." She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since their reunion. Behind the successful businessman was still the kind, passionate man she had once loved. The thought both comforted and frightened her. "One step at a time," she said quietly. "First, we clear my name. Then we see what kind of future I can build." As she left his office, Diane watched her with undisguised hostility. Isabella now understood. This woman had blocked her desperate messages years ago, perhaps out of misguided loyalty or something more personal. But dwelling on that wouldn't help her now. Outside, the city sparkled after the recent rain. Isabella breathed deeply, clutching the folder that contained her possible redemption. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to believe that her long nightmare might finally be ending. And if her heart beat a little faster when she thought of Alexander, well, that was a complication she would deal with later. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations as Isabella sat rigidly beside her lawyer, a renowned attorney named Peter Chen. After months of preparation, the day had finally arrived, her chance to clear her name. Her hands trembled slightly, and she clasped them together to hide her nervousness. "You okay?" Peter asked quietly. Isabella nodded, not trusting her voice. Across the aisle, Bradley Gregory sat with his defense team, looking thinner than she remembered, but still with that same smug confidence. He had been extradited from Argentina 3 weeks ago, fighting every step of the way. Alexander slipped into the bench directly behind her. He had attended every pre-trial hearing, always sitting in the same spot, close enough to support her, but giving her the space to fight this battle on her own terms. "All rise," the bailiff called as the judge entered. What followed was a day of technical testimony about bank transfers, document forensics, and email trails. Experts confirmed that the signatures on key financial documents were indeed forgeries. Bradley's former assistant testified that she had seen him practicing Isabella's signature late at night in the office. When it was Isabella's turn to take the stand, she felt a strange calm settle over her. She had waited 3 years for this moment. "Ms. Morrison," the prosecutor began, "could you tell the court about your professional relationship with the defendant?" Isabella spoke clearly, describing how they had worked together, how she had trusted Bradley completely. She explained how she first learned of the missing client funds and the shock of discovering she was being blamed. "And when did you realize Mr. Gregory had framed you?" the prosecutor asked. "I suspected it immediately," Isabella replied. "But I couldn't prove it. By the time the authorities began investigating, he had disappeared, and all evidence pointed to me as his accomplice." Bradley's lawyer tried to paint her as a willing participant during cross-examination, suggesting she had enjoyed the benefits of the stolen money. But Isabella remained steady, explaining her simple lifestyle before losing everything. "If I had millions in stolen funds," she said pointedly, "would I have ended up homeless for 3 years?" A murmur ran through the courtroom. Most people were hearing this part of her story for the first time. By late afternoon, the evidence was overwhelming. The judge called a brief recess before closing arguments. Isabella stepped into the hallway, needing a moment alone. The weight of the day pressed down on her. "You were incredible in there." Alexander's voice came from behind her. She turned to see him holding 2 cups of coffee. He offered one to her, and she took it gratefully. "It feels surreal," she admitted. 3 years of people thinking I was a criminal, and now the truth is finally coming out," he finished for her. They stood in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee. Something had changed between them over these past months. Working together on the New Horizons project, they had rediscovered their old rhythm, the easy understanding they once shared. But there was something new too, a deeper appreciation born from loss and reunion. "Whatever happens in there," Alexander said softly, "you've already won. The architectural community is talking about your New Horizons designs. 3 potential clients have asked specifically for you to lead projects for them." Isabella smiled, touched by his efforts to reassure her. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did." Before he could respond, Peter appeared at the doorway. "They're calling us back in." The closing arguments were brief. Bradley's lawyer tried one last attempt to create reasonable doubt, but his arguments fell flat against the mountain of evidence. When the judge announced that all charges against Isabella were dismissed and that Bradley was being held for sentencing, the relief nearly brought her to her knees. "The court would also like to note," the judge added, "that Ms. Morrison appears to have been a victim of significant injustice. The court recommends a full investigation into how the original evidence was handled." Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around, shouting questions. The case had become something of a sensation, the homeless architect wrongfully accused, the billionaire ex-fiancée who helped clear her name. It was the kind of story people loved. Isabella stood frozen before the wall of cameras, overwhelmed by the attention. Then she felt Alexander's steady hand at the small of her back. "You don't have to talk to them," he whispered. But Isabella straightened her shoulders. "Yes, I do. For 3 years, no one would listen to me. Now they will." She stepped forward and began to speak, her voice growing stronger with each word. She talked about losing everything, about the broken justice system that had failed her, about the countless others who didn't have billionaire ex-fiancés to help them prove their innocence. "What will you do now?" a reporter called out. Isabella glanced at Alexander before answering. "I'm going to keep designing buildings that help people live better lives, starting with housing for those who have experienced homelessness like I did." Later, as they walked away from the courthouse, Alexander asked the question she had been expecting. "Would you stay in New York? Continue with New Horizons?" Isabella paused, looking out at the city that had both broken and remade her. "I want to," she said honestly, "but I need to do it on my own terms, not as the woman you rescued." Alexander nodded, understanding in his eyes. "The company that owns your firm has offered to sell it back to you at a nominal price. I may have mentioned to them that it would be good publicity after your case." Isabella stared at him. "My old firm. They're willing to let me take over. With your name cleared and your recent work gaining attention, they'd be fools not to. Your reputation is going to soar after this case." The thought of reclaiming her firm, of rebuilding it with her new perspective and values, filled Isabella with excitement. But a small worry nagged at her. "If I take back my firm, we won't be working together anymore," she said carefully, watching his face. Alexander smiled. "Maybe that's not a bad thing. It's hard to date your boss." The word date hung in the air between them. They had been dancing around this possibility for weeks, both afraid to disrupt their fragile reconnection. "Is that what you want?" Isabella asked, her heart beating faster. "To date me?" Alexander took her hand, his touch gentle. "What I want is for you to rebuild your life exactly as you choose to. And if that life has room in it for me, in whatever way feels right to you, I'd like that very much." Isabella looked down at their joined hands, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers. After everything, the pain of their separation, the years of suffering, the fight to clear her name, this simple touch felt like coming home. "One step at a time," she said, echoing her words from months ago. But this time, she squeezed his hand and didn't let go as they walked away from the courthouse, toward whatever future they might build together. 6 months after the trial, Isabella stood at the large windows of her new office, watching the sunset paint the city in golden light. The past half year had been a whirlwind of change. With her name cleared and her reputation restored, she had indeed taken back her old firm. She renamed it Morrison Designs and moved to a modest office space that fit her new vision. The financial settlement from Bradley's case had given her the funds to start fresh, though the amount was far less than what had been stolen. Most of the money had disappeared in Bradley's gambling debts. Still, it was enough for Isabella to buy a small apartment of her own and rebuild her firm with a clear focus on community-centered projects. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. "Still on for dinner?" "I have news." Isabella smiled. They had been taking things slowly, rediscovering each other as the people they had become. Weekly dinners, occasional weekend outings, careful conversations about their past and possible future. It was both familiar and entirely new. She typed back, "See you at 7. I have news too." Her news was significant. Earlier that day, she had finalized plans for her most ambitious project yet. Drawing from her own experience of homelessness, she had designed a transitional housing community that would help people move from the streets to stable homes through a series of supportive steps. The designs laid open on her desk were unlike anything she had created before. They reflected all she had learned during those 3 hard years, the small dignities that mattered when you had nothing, the way spaces could either heal or harm vulnerable people, the importance of both community and privacy. Her secretary poked her head in. "Your 5 o'clock is here." Isabella welcomed a young architect who had been homeless himself before working his way through school. He was one of several people she had hired specifically because their life experiences gave them insights no formal education could provide. Together, they reviewed the final changes to the transitional housing plans until it was time for Isabella to leave for her dinner with Alexander. The restaurant was a small Italian place they had discovered together, nothing fancy but with food that reminded Alexander of his grandmother's cooking. Isabella arrived to find him already at their usual corner table, looking slightly nervous as he played with his water glass. "What's this big news?" she asked after greeting him with a quick kiss on the cheek. Alexander took a deep breath. I've been offered a position leading a new urban development initiative. It would mean overseeing citywide projects focused on equitable growth and affordable housing. Isabella's face lit up. Alexander, that's perfect for you. Congratulations. He nodded, but his expression remained serious. There's just one complication. It's in Chicago. The word hummed between them. Chicago. Hundreds of miles away. After finding each other again by pure chance, after everything they had rebuilt together, now distance would separate them once more. When would you leave? Isabella asked quietly. 2 months, if I take it. He reached across the table to take her hand. I haven't decided yet. Isabella squeezed his fingers gently. This is exactly the kind of work you've been wanting to do. More meaningful than commercial development. You have to take it. What about us? Alexander asked, the question simple but loaded with implications. Isabella thought about her own news, about the plans sitting on her desk, about the future she had been carefully building. My turn for some news, she said. Remember my transitional housing project, the one I've been designing? Alexander nodded. The one with the stepped approach to getting people back on their feet. It's brilliant. The city approved the funding this morning, she told him, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. We break ground next month. Isabella, that's wonderful. His genuine happiness for her success was one of the things she had come to love about this new version of Alexander. He was secure enough in his own achievements to celebrate hers wholeheartedly. I can't leave now, she continued. This project, it's everything I've been working toward. It's my chance to help people who were in my situation. Alexander nodded, understanding in his eyes but disappointment too. So we're back where we started. Me leaving for a career opportunity, you staying for yours. Isabella had been thinking about this possibility all afternoon, ever since he had mentioned having news. They had been here before, 7 years ago, making the practical choice to separate rather than try to maintain a long-distance relationship. No, she said firmly. This isn't like before. We're not the same people we were then. What are you suggesting? Alexander asked, hope creeping into his voice. I'm suggesting we try, really try. Chicago isn't that far. We can visit on weekends. We have video calls now. We're both established enough in our careers to take occasional days off. Alexander looked surprised. You want to do long distance, after what happened last time? Isabella thought about how easily they had lost each other before, how a simple lie from a jealous classmate and a well-meaning but controlling assistant had kept them apart during the years they needed each other most. Last time, we gave up too easily, she said. We didn't fight for what we had. I don't want to make that mistake again. Alexander's face softened. Neither do I. He squeezed her hand. But your project will take at least 2 years to complete. That's a long time to be apart. 2 years is nothing compared to the 7 we already lost, Isabella pointed out. And who knows? Maybe after you get the Chicago initiative running smoothly, you could bring your expertise back here. Or maybe when my project is done, I could look at opportunities there. For the first time, they were talking about a real future together, one with plans and possibilities instead of clean breaks and final goodbyes. Over dinner, they began mapping out how it might work. Weekend visits alternating between cities, daily video calls, shared online calendars to coordinate their busy schedules. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing about their journey had been easy so far. As they walked back to Isabella's apartment through the cool evening air, Alexander stopped suddenly under a streetlight. I have something for you, he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. Isabella's heart jumped, but when she opened it, she found not a ring but a key. It's to my Chicago apartment, Alexander explained. I bought it last year as an investment property. I want you to have a key to know you're always welcome there. And maybe someday. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The key represented a door left open between them, a future with possibilities rather than definitive endings. Isabella closed her fingers around the key, feeling its weight. I have something for you too, she said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a rolled blueprint. Alexander unrolled it carefully. It was a detailed drawing of her transitional housing project, but with an addition he hadn't seen before. A small building near the entrance with Raid Community Center written above the door. I want a piece of you to be part of this project, even when you're in Chicago, Isabella explained. This center will offer job training, financial literacy classes, and counseling, all the support services people need to truly get back on their feet. Alexander looked at her with such tenderness that Isabella felt her heart expand in her chest. They had found their way back to each other against all odds, and now they would find a way to build a future together, even if that future required patience, creativity, and frequent flyer miles. As they continued walking, hand in hand under the city lights, Isabella thought about the strange, difficult path that had led her here. 3 years ago, she had been sleeping on park benches, convinced her life was over. Now she was designing buildings again, running her own firm, and reconnecting with the love she had thought was lost forever. Some might call it fate. Isabella preferred to think of it as resilience, the human capacity to endure, to rebuild, and to love again, even after everything falls apart. 2 years later, Isabella stood before a large crowd gathered for the grand opening of Hope Haven, her transitional housing community. The morning sun shone down on a collection of buildings that had once existed only in her dreams and notebook sketches. Now they were real. Homes for people who had none, a stepping stone back to stability for those who had lost everything, just as she once had. She gripped the podium tightly, looking out at the faces watching her. City officials sat in the front row, alongside potential donors and community leaders. Reporters stood at the sides, cameras ready. But the people Isabella focused on were at the back, the first group of residents who would move in today. People who had been living on the streets or in shelters, people whose stories echoed her own. 3 years ago, she began, her voice clear in the microphone, I was homeless. I slept on park benches and in shelters when I could get a spot. I had once been a successful architect, but after being wrongfully accused of financial crimes, I lost everything, my career, my home, my dignity. A hush fell over the crowd. Many knew parts of her story from news coverage of the trial, but hearing it directly from her was different. During those years, I learned something important about buildings. I learned that they're not just walls and roofs, they're expressions of how we value human life. The cold bench that was my bed taught me that some spaces say you don't matter. The noisy, dangerous shelter told me you deserve only the bare minimum. Isabella gestured to the buildings behind her. Hope Haven says something different. It says you matter. It says your journey back deserves support. It says dignity is not a luxury. The simple homes were arranged in a horseshoe shape around gardens and community spaces. Some were studio apartments for individuals, others small family units. The Reed Community Center stood near the entrance, already staffed with counselors, job trainers, and financial advisors. What makes Hope Haven different is that it recognizes that homelessness isn't just about lacking a physical shelter. It's about losing connection to others, to opportunity, sometimes even to hope. These buildings are designed to rebuild those connections, step by step. As Isabella continued explaining the project's unique features, she caught sight of a familiar figure slipping in at the back of the crowd. Alexander had flown in from Chicago last night, promising to make it for the ceremony despite his packed schedule. Seeing him there, his eyes shining with pride, gave her the strength to finish her speech. Hope Haven wouldn't exist without many people's support. Our city officials who approved the project, the contractors who often worked at cost, the donors who believed in this vision. She paused. And one person who believed in me when no one else did, who helped me clear my name and find my way back to myself. After the ribbon cutting, Isabella showed the first residents to their new homes. One woman, about Isabella's age, stood in her small apartment with tears streaming down her face. I've been sleeping in my car for 8 months, she whispered. I can't believe I have walls again. A door that locks. Isabella understood exactly what she meant. The simple security of a door, the dignity of privacy. These were things people didn't appreciate until they were gone. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Alexander approached her. That was quite a speech, he said, pulling her into a hug. I'm so proud of you. The past 2 years of long-distance relationship hadn't been easy. Video calls couldn't replace real presence. Weekend visits always ended too soon. But they had made it work, their commitment to each other growing stronger rather than weaker with distance. I missed you, Isabella said, relaxing into his embrace. How long can you stay this time? Alexander's smile held a secret. Actually, I have news. The Chicago initiative is running smoothly now. My deputy director is ready to take over. Isabella pulled back to look at him. What are you saying? I'm saying I've been offered a position here, working with the mayor's office on affordable housing policy. I'd be liaising with projects exactly like this one. Joy bubbled up inside her. You're moving back. He nodded. If that's okay with you. I know we've gotten used to our independence, our separate spaces. In response, Isabella reached into her pocket and pulled out a key. I had this made yesterday, she said, pressing it into his palm. To my apartment. I think 2 years of flying back and forth is enough, don't you? Alexander's face lit up. He pulled something from his own pocket, a small velvet box, not a key this time. Isabella's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a simple but elegant ring. I've been carrying this for months, waiting for the right moment, he said softly. Seeing you today, making your vision reality, helping all these people. I've never been more certain that you're the most extraordinary person I've ever known. He didn't kneel, didn't make a show of it, just held the ring between them, an offering rather than a performance. We found each other twice against impossible odds. I don't want to risk losing you a third time. Marry me, Isabella. Not right away if you're not ready, but someday. Isabella looked at the ring, then at Hope Haven behind them, then back at Alexander's hopeful face. 7 years ago, they had let each other go to pursue their separate dreams. 3 years ago, fate had brought them back together in the most unlikely way. Now, they stood on the threshold of a future neither could have imagined during those dark days. Yes, she said simply, not someday. Soon. As Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, a small group of the new residents noticed and broke into spontaneous applause. Isabella blushed, but then she took Alexander's hand and turned to face them. Everyone, she called out, I want you to meet someone special. This is Alexander. Like all of us, he knows what it means to lose something important and find it again. One of the older residents, a man with kind eyes and a weathered face, stepped forward. Miss Morrison, we took up a collection. It's not much, but we wanted to thank you somehow. He handed her a clumsily wrapped package. Inside was a framed pencil drawing of Hope Haven, clearly done by hand with careful attention to detail. At the bottom, a dozen signatures surrounded the words, from those who found hope again to the woman who never lost hers. Isabella couldn't hold back her tears then. She had come full circle, from sketching buildings in her worn notebook on a park bench to holding this gift from people who understood exactly what these buildings meant. That evening, Alexander and Isabella walked through the quiet community. Lights glowed from the windows of the new homes. In the community center, a group was sharing a meal together. Life was already taking root here. What's next? Alexander asked, his arm around her shoulders. After you've changed the world with this place? Isabella smiled, looking out at her creation. There are still so many people without homes, without second chances. One project isn't enough. Morrison Designs goes national, he suggested, or maybe global. She leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body next to hers. Maybe, but first I want to enjoy this. Enjoy us. We've all spent enough time without a real home. As the stars appeared above them, Isabella thought about the incredible journey that had brought her here. From success to rock bottom to redemption, from lost love to found love, from homelessness to creating homes for others. Some people called her story a fairy tale, the homeless woman and the billionaire reunited by chance. But Isabella knew better. Their story wasn't about luck or magic. It was about resilience, about second chances, about the powerful truth that sometimes losing everything is just the beginning of finding something greater than you ever imagined. And that was a story worth building a life on.